Hey everyone, welcome to the second lecture recording for week 5, where we're going to talk about interview techniques. Interviews are a really interesting method, I think, because they allow people to tell stories. It really appeals to me as a researcher, and I've done a lot of interviews over the years. It's pretty much my main methodology that I use in my own research. I just really love the way it allows people to kind of give you their own narrative and to kind of follow people along with their own perspectives and takes on things so that you can learn a little bit about their social world. It's also a really flexible method that can be used in a lot of different types of research questions and with a lot of different styles and techniques. We'll only really scratch the surface in this class, but I will give you, towards the end of the lecture, some ideas about alternative interview techniques that you can use and that might be relevant for some of your projects. One thing that's tricky about interviews is that the questions really need to be carefully operationalized so that you're not just asking your research question, that you really have questions that are kind of getting indirectly, cumulatively at your research question, but you're not just kind of dropping. And I'm going to give you some examples of that later in this lecture that are taken from the study of administrative assistants that we're going to discuss in class. Interviews are also useful in community-based research methods because they give stakeholders a place in your research design, that if you're using interviews to get their perspectives, it allows them to kind of tell that story, give their perspectives, give their own set of interests or values that you can incorporate then into your research project in the way that we try to do when we're using community-based research methods. Overall, it's also kind of a weird method. We're not really at a distance from our research partners when we're using interview methods. With a survey, we can kind of have this distance between us and the folks that we want to learn from. With interviews, we're not really necessarily face-to-face in the era of COVID-19, but at the same time, we're having a real human interaction with somebody, asking them questions, getting answers, and it makes it kind of a little bit awkward sometimes, but it also can be really amazing when it works well because we can have that really one-on-one interaction and really learn from their perspectives and take that into account for our research question. So as I said on the prior slide, one of the real challenges for interviews is turning your concepts into questions. And we can't just ask our research question or some portion of our research question directly in most cases. The main reason is because our concepts may not make any sense to our research partners, the people that we're interviewing. We have to turn those concepts into questions that make some sense to the folks we're interviewing so that they can make meaning out of them and respond in a meaningful way too. So for example, from the study of the administrative assistants, this is kind of their research question. How does your position as an administrative assistant allow you to develop sustainable behaviors, to grow in your knowledge of sustainability goals at Colgate, and to develop interest in sustainability? We could just kind of ask that and see what people say, but we wouldn't be very successful because it's kind of overwhelming and there's certain kind of jargon in there in terms of the concepts that people might not know about, like grow in knowledge or develop interest. Those are sort of everyday words, and so those might be a little bit more accessible than some of the other things that we could use. But certainly even sustainable behaviors, or the word sustainability itself, if we go back to the beginning of the semester, we talked about how sustainability as a concept is not always easy to define. It has multiple dimensions, the 3 pillars and so forth. So if we really want to get at all those pillars or some portion of them, we'd have to design our questions so that we can really carefully get at those and bring our interview partner along with us in a way that works for them and translated our research question into terms that make sense to them. So the actual interview questions that are used in the AA study include things like, within your office space, do you and your fellow staff members engage in any behaviors that you would consider sustainable? So that one, you're still using the word sustainability, but it's letting them kind of define it. What do they do, and do they consider it sustainable? And you could follow up and say, why is it that you think that's sustainable, or are there certain things that you think that are good that come from that particular behavior that you're engaging in? Second question, what do you know about Colgate sustainability initiatives? So kind of testing knowledge there. And how did you get this information? Where did you learn it from? Third question, is is sustainability at Colgate important to you and why? So in each of those cases, they're taking things like behaviors, knowledge, and values, turning them into questions that are accessible to the research partner, and then seeing what they say. So there's this translation we really have to do that's really critical when we're doing interviews, or as we'll see next week when we talk about surveys, the same deal, where we have to find ways to make our questions accessible. Research questions turned into interview questions is a process of operationalization. When I said before that interviews are a flexible method, one of the ways in which they're flexible is through the structure of the interview instrument or protocol that's used. In other words, the list of questions, how do you set it up, and what format does it take? You can kind of think of a spectrum or a continuum of interview techniques that go from very structured, in other words, you give questions that have very specific answers that the participants can choose from, to really open-ended on the other end of the spectrum, where maybe you just keep it super open and say, let's talk. That would be the most unstructured way you could possibly do an interview. Just kind of start your recorder, say, let's talk, and see what they say. So most research is kind of somewhere in the middle, but let's talk about those different spectrums of structure and when we would want to use one or another and what their pros and cons are. For a really structured approach, it's really more like a survey where we ask a question and we maybe give A, B, C, D responses that people can choose from. And structure it in such a way that they don't really have unlimited choices for their answers. We're really crafting the questions to limit the choice of the responses to a few so that we don't get quite as much variation. But on the other hand, it's harder to capture some of the complex meanings or to find unexpected discoveries because we've structured the answers in such a way that people can't very easily go off script, especially if we're really sticking to our protocol. That's really good for situations where we want to do more quantitative analysis. If we wanted to do something that was going to be more amenable to statistical analysis, we wanted to have a representative sample that allowed us to do that type of analysis for our data, then a structured approach is pretty good. It's also useful if we have multiple researchers that might all be doing interviews at the same time, maybe in multiple sites. That way we have more consistency in terms of how the questions are asked and answered because we only have certain choices for how the answers can be given for each question. It's not really that good when we have open-ended questions and we want to do exploratory research, or maybe when we really want to bring in our community partners in a kind of an open way without kind of just saying to them, hey, here's what your choices are. But it does have those advantages in terms of structure and really helping us to limit the responses that people can give for interview questions. In the most unstructured end of the continuum, we would basically flip all those things that are in the first column. So we would have questions that are really open-ended and aren't structured in terms of their responses and really allow the participants to set the agenda and to go whatever directions they want to. And this has the advantage of really allowing us to kind of explore and discover things that we might not have anticipated from the start. When we have a structured approach, we kind of really need to know what the boundaries are of what people might say and how they can answer and build a structure around that. If we do an unstructured approach, we're allowing people to kind of set their own course in the interview and follow along with them and see where they go. As I said before, that's a useful way sometimes to build community because we can allow them to set that agenda for themselves and we're not dictating where to go as the researcher. We treat them more as a research partner that way. Really, most interviews, especially kind of more of a qualitative approach, do a semi-structured. So we're somewhere in the middle between a totally structured or a totally unstructured approach. It kind of gives us some of the pros of each side by allowing us to have some structure, but not too much structure overall. And it still allows our participants to kind of go in directions that maybe we didn't anticipate, but at the same time, we get some answers that we kind of wanted to get when we're coming in. So there's a balance there between just letting people say whatever they want and giving them a ton of structure and kind of really guiding them and limiting their choices. So in that case, we would actually have a list of questions that we would usually want to go in with, but at the same time, we would allow some space for people to talk about things that we didn't anticipate and for us to be able to probe and follow up on those things so that we can dig deeper, get more meanings, get more stories from people, and really take advantage of those things that are really the pros, the strengths of interview research methods. Okay, so how do we actually ask interview questions? It's a really complex topic, and I won't be able to give you total in-depth training in how to develop interview questions, but we will see some examples in class where I'll give you some examples of interview protocols that I've used in my own research. And of course, we have the study of AAs as an example too for us to study. But in terms of asking interview questions, here's a few tips. I would say that if you're doing a semi-structured approach, having a list about 10 questions with a few follow-ups for each of them, where you're anticipating where things might go, what might be interesting for you to follow up on, and be prepared to go off script if necessary. For example, if your interview participant touches on a topic that's on your list as question number 7, it's okay to jump ahead in the list of interview questions and cover that topic and maybe come back later on to some of your earlier questions and then go back again. So you maybe have this outline for how you want things to go, but you don't necessarily have to follow it strictly in order. But you really want to come in prepared with some questions that, again, are carefully operationalized so that you can get answers to the questions that you want without asking with a lot of jargon your research question and using concepts that are things you know but they might not know. You want to start out easy, and I usually like to ask a question that I call a warm-up question, where you ask about people's background, asking about their education, where they grew up, how they got to where they are now in life is a good way to start because it allows them to tell their story, and it's a little bit less pressure than asking a question about why or how they do things. Ask more about what and who they are, and then go to those other types of questions later on. You always want to use silence to your advantage. This can be, again, kind of awkward in an interview setting where you might feel some pressure to kind of fill the silence as the interviewer or the researcher, that if there's an awkward pause, you might want to fill in, jump to the next question, or rephrase your question, but you always want to resist that impulse and use that silence. Even just a short amount of silence can really be powerful, and you kind of play this waiting game with your research partner to let them think about stuff and go next. So let's try it and see how it goes. Here's just 10 seconds of silence. How does it feel? 10 seconds. It goes by pretty quick, but at the same time, when you're under that pressure, or you maybe feel pressure in an interview situation, it can feel like an eternity. But again, you want to resist that. And in some cases, you just really need to give people more time to think. If you ask a challenging question, a question that's kind of deep, maybe people need time to collect their thoughts. And so you want to give them that space and allow them the ability to be able to collect their thoughts and answer your question. You always want to follow up on any responses that you think are interesting and require more probing, more depth, or any time that things are incomplete. And this is where one of my top tips for interviewing is to always ask for examples, especially if somebody's being kind of vague or they seem like they're being coy maybe, and they say, like say in response to those questions in the AA study, do you ever do any practices that you consider sustainable in your office? People say, yeah, we have some things that we do. Well, you definitely want to follow up and ask for examples and see what do they do, and then follow up and say why they think it's sustainable. So probing, going for more depth, asking for examples, that's where we really get that detail, that nitty-gritty that is so important in qualitative research, and for interview techniques being a real strength of being able to get that depth, to be able to dive in. As part of the process of doing interview research, we always want to record our interview responses. Do an audio recording whenever possible, to the extent that it's permitted by the research partner or participant. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about research ethics and the Institutional Review Board. Research partners always have a choice about whether to be recorded or not, but if people are willing to do it, you should always record, because that's your data. You're getting words that people are speaking at you, and so you always want to have a recording of that. And it's good to take notes, especially because I think it helps you focus. It helps me focus if I'm taking notes at the same time that I'm listening to and participating with someone. I'm less likely to kind of zone out. but we don't want just handwritten notes to be our main record. We want to get every word, every nuance, and have that there as our data. So use something like an iPhone or a smartphone. You can also get recorders checked out from the library. Those are things that you want to use and make sure that you carefully record and back up the data that you have from an interview. You can also, as I was saying before, use interview techniques that are not just based around verbal questions. There's a lot of different ways to elicit responses. One good way that a lot of researchers use is this method called photo elicitation, where we show pictures to people and use those along with verbal questions as a way of eliciting responses. Lots of other structures too. You can show people objects or ask them about tools they use, especially if you're kind of in a work setting. Asking about tools, asking about procedures or practices are good ways to get people to talk about how they do things and why they do things. So we don't always have to use just words. There's a lot of other ways we can elicit responses as well. So last topic for this particular lecture recording, let's talk about sampling for interview projects. For doing a qualitative interview study, you're more likely to use those non-probabilistic techniques like a purposive or a quota or a snowball sample, where we're looking to get a particular sample, but we might not care quite as much about representativeness and using statistical techniques, or there's a challenge where we actually can't get a representative probabilistic sample, and so we use a non-probabilistic technique. Again, it all depends on a research question, the availability of a sample frame, and the goals that we have for our research project. In other cases, we actually might use a probabilistic sampling technique, especially if we want to do a lot of interviews and do some kind of statistical analysis on the results. One thing that's important about developing your connection with interview partners and even just gaining access to get permission to interview them is developing a research persona. Research persona is just a way of describing who you are as a researcher. So it kind of tells your interview participants the who, what, where, when, how of your interaction with them as a researcher. Who are you? Why are you doing this? What are you going to do in terms of the interview process? It's good to kind of think through a little script that you can say to people, whether it's through an email that you're sending to them, if you're calling them to set up an interview. You need to kind of explain what you're doing and why. And this is where it's actually really good to be a student, because you can use that student identity to help develop the connection there. So use your student identity and ask for help as a way of developing that connection with a research participant. And overall, don't worry too much. If you're stressed about an interview, it's okay to feel that way, but just know that people kind of like to talk about themselves. If you sit down and give people an opportunity to speak about their lives, who they are, what they do, why they do it, a lot of people actually really enjoy that and take some satisfaction in the fact that someone actually cares about them. Someone wants to listen to them. And that's one thing that's really, I think, fun about interview techniques, is that connection that you can develop and really getting to learn from somebody and kind of feeling that sense of satisfaction that they have from telling you their story.